Welcome to Beyond Aladdin and Miss Saigon, exploring the possibilities of Asian American theater. Before we begin this event, I would like to recite the Virginia Tech Land Acknowledgement. We acknowledge the Tutelo and Monacan people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live, and recognize their continuing connection to the land, water, and air that Virginia Tech consumes. We pay respect to the Tutelo and Monacan nations and to their elders past, present, and emerging. We also acknowledge the university's historical ties to the indentured and enslaved whose labors built this institution. We pay respect to those people for their contributions to Virginia Tech. So welcome again. My name is Dr. Nina Ha, and I'm the director of the Asian Cultural Engagement Center, or the A Center. It is my honor, privilege, and pleasure to introduce Dr. Josephine Lee, who is professor of English and Asian American Studies at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Asian American Literature and Culture. She is currently working on a new project on the intersections of blackface and yellowface in 19th and early 20th century American theater and performance. I hope to bring you back for that one as well. Her previous books include The Japan of Pure Invention, Gilbert and Sullivan's The Mikado, and Performing Asian America, Race and Ethnicity on the Contemporary Stage. She has also co-edited Asian American Plays for a New Generation, and Recollecting Early Asian America, Essays in Cultural History, as well as Asian American Literature in Transition, Volume 1, 1850 to 1830. More importantly, I've known Dr. Lee since she was my advisor as an undergraduate at Smith College and has witnessed my journey in academia since that time. I aspire to be like Dr. Lee, someone who is a role model and mentor, no matter the time or distance. Thank you, Dr. Lee, or Joe, for all that you've done in supporting me, and not only me, but also the APITA community. So welcome.
Thank you so very much, Nina. You are going to make me cry. As you always do, because I'm so darn proud of you. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen, and in a minute I'll kind of flip back to just my face view as I talk. But can you give me a heads up if you can see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. So as Nina said, I am at the University of Minnesota, the Twin Cities campus. Our campus is located on the kind of confluence of two rivers. And before I begin my talk, I want to acknowledge that where I am right now are on the traditional homelands of the Dakota peoples, which were ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. It's also where the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, and other tribal nations have lived for generations. And as an educator, I strive to better my own knowledge of these peoples in order to gain support, resources, and programming for Indigenous peoples here and elsewhere. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about something that not a lot of people actually think about, which is my own passion in some ways, and that's the theater. I've been interested in theater ever since I can remember. And I've been thinking a lot about what thinking about theater can offer us in terms of sort of today's questions, particularly about today's questions regarding Asian American identity and experience. And in a slide or two, I'm just going to flip back and ask you all what questions and concerns you're thinking about today. And hopefully I can relate some of what I'm going to say today to those specific concerns. So I think that theater, because it's a live art form, gives us a certain kind of perspective on the here and now. Because it's fictional, it takes place on a stage, and it's made up for the most part. It helps us think about race in particular and relationships and how things are performed and constructed and how they might change. And it also helps us think about how off stage and on stage there are certain historical patterns around which we organize our thoughts about race. And so I've been thinking about this ever since I wrote my first book, which was Performing Asian American, and it was about Asian American drama, and that was quite a while ago. But more recently, I've been doing more research on kind of historical foundations. So theater from the late 19th and early 20th century in particular. I'm going to go over some of those findings today, and I'm just going to warn people that there are going to be some violent and offensive racial images that we'll look at together. And we're going to talk about, how looking at different stereotypes of Orientals, and I will say that there are at least 3 that we'll talk about today, and possibly more. How does looking at these stereotypes help us understand Asian American history and representation? We'll talk a little bit about works like Aladdin, Madame Butterfly, Miss Saigon. We'll talk about the history of white actors in yellowface, which is a subject that a number of people have talked about recently. And we'll look at other stereotypes like the yellow peril and the perpetual foreigner and the model minority. And if we have time, I'd like to talk about some examples of Asian American theater. But I'm really mindful that it's hard to talk about work that people haven't gotten a chance to see. So I will save that for last and see if there is time to do that. So I'd like to kind of stop sharing for just a minute, and maybe you could indulge me by putting in the chat some of the things that you're thinking about right now, and I'll just sort of read things as they come up in the chat. Are there questions or comments or things that are on your mind, particularly about kind of Asian American experience that you'd like to share with people?
I think,
So, go
yeah,
ahead.
Jungwon wrote, too generalized to hold their complexities.
Uh-huh. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a term in some ways that just kind of breaks apart even as you unpack it. I often tell my students that Asian American is a term that is as divided as a term could be, right? That has its fractures, right? That falls apart even as you try to hold on to it. Are there other comments, concerns? Okay, our daughter-in-law is Asian American. How best to talk to her about these issues without being offensive, right? And I would imagine that this comment is about so many issues, right? That there are a lot of issues right now that I think I and other people are thinking about in a way that feels much more dramatic than it has for a very long time. And that has to do with the anti-Asian violence that's going on in the time of COVID. The recent murders in Atlanta have really brought to the forefront a lot of issues. Thank you. Theater now has more Asian leads without the focal characteristic being their ethnicity, like Once on This Island and Hadestown. Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, the question of what we call sometimes in the business called colorblind casting or cross-racial casting or color-sensitive casting, and there are all those different ways of thinking about it. So I love those examples. I'll throw another one out there. A lot of people have talked about Philippe Assu in Hamilton, right, which has got a lot of African American, Latinx, and Asian American actors playing white characters. That's great. Are there other questions? Okay, so very, very great questions and a range of questions that draw attention to, I think, a larger question about theatrical and maybe film and media representation. And so I'll sort of turn to that for this overview. So I think this is in some ways, a very hard time for Asian Americans. It's a hard time during the pandemic. It's a hard time politically, but it's also a time of great opportunity. And people have talked about, how now more than ever there's the opportunity for new visibility. And so I'll just point out a few examples that a lot of people have been talking about. Of course, the film Minari just is garnering quite a lot of attention and some awards. Minari has been preceded by a number of other performances in the last few years that people have pointed to as being sort of breakthroughs. And, the most recent perhaps are things like the movie The Farewell. There's also Nomadland, right? Chloe Zhao's success as a director. Crazy Rich Asians, the romantic comedy. And Ms. Marvel. We finally have an Asian American Ms. Marvel. And I want to point to a much earlier example, mainly because it's one that a lot of people have seen, which is the presentation of Russell, the character of Russell in the Pixar movie Up, which is a presentation character who was not only voiced by an Asian American actor, Jordan Nagai, but was also based on the face and some of the personality of a Pixar animator, Peter Son, who is Korean American. And so some of these sort of questions about representation almost seem like, my students at some point sometimes say, well, why are we still talking about this, right? Why are we still talking about this when there seem to be Asian Americans everywhere now? That is a good question. I think that in some ways the new visibility mirrors the sort of demographic pattern of Asian American population. And I often talk to my students and ask them why a graph looks something like this. And then, people talk about the reasons why the Asian American population has spiked in the past couple of decades, particularly. And there is this kind of bump that starts to take place, or this rise that starts to take place in the 1960s with the changes in law and policy heralded by the 1965 Immigration Act. That legal action, that change in immigration law, changed the pattern of American immigration history away from what we call the exclusion era, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit about this history today, but in some ways it's a much richer and more dense history than I can go into. So I'll just recommend a book called The Making of Asian Americans by my colleague here in Asian American history, Erica Lee. And it's a marvelous historical account. But I'm going to be relating the history more to sort of cultural representations. So a lot of people are much more familiar with the cultural representations than they are with the history. And so maybe people could think about, whether or not you've seen instances of what we might call our racial archetypes or racial stereotypes. And I'm going to start with a very familiar one that is often in the news even today, which is of the Asian or Asian American woman as a kind of objectified and hyper feminine object. So I think that in some ways the recent Atlanta shootings, unfortunately, sort of talked about the linkage between race and gender in terms of how Asian women are often thought of as these sort of always hypersexualized objects. So here's Katy Perry at the 2013 American Music Awards. And Perry got a lot of flack for dressing up as what she saw to be a Japanese geisha outfit. She said she didn't mean any harm by it. She was just doing it out of a sense of fun and perhaps respect. But other people identified this as a kind of pattern by which the Asian female character is always presented as a kind of an object, right? An ornament, a commodity in some ways. People have linked Perry's presentation to famous theatrical and operatic representations, like the most famous of which is the Madame Butterfly character. And Madame Butterfly was a story that first grew out of a set of works of fiction, including a short story by John Luther Long, which was written in the end of the 19th century. That was made into a stage play by David Belasco in 1900, and then that was followed by probably the most famous version of the story, which is Giacomo Puccini's opera Madama Butterfly, which debuted in 1904. So the popularity of this story, which in some ways is about a interracial relationship, a young teenage Japanese girl is put in an arranged marriage with an American naval lieutenant. He abandons her, and then she is pregnant with his child. She gives up all hope of a successful life in Japan in return for his love, but he has married a white American woman. And when the wife, returns for the baby that Koko-san, who is the Japanese woman, has been nurturing, Koko-san kills herself in order that the baby can go to America. So this kind of tragic tale sort of sets the stage for a certain kind of, image of Asian and Asian American women. And I just want to kind of flag the ways in which this tragic tale, which while seemingly sympathetic to the Asian woman, also sort of boxes her in as a exotic and attractive and a desirable object, but one that is also easily disposed of at the end. So in some ways, what's interesting is that as the silent film actress Anna May Wong once said, the idea of the Asian or Asian American woman sort of appearing, particularly in American theater and film, is that this was a very popular image, right? There were a lot of productions of this. So you cannot say that Asian female figures were completely absent from the American theater. But what you can say is that what appeared was a type, and it was inevitably a tragic type. And Anna May Wong complained that every role she ever was given, she had to die, like, in it, right, by some way, shape, or form, because her story had to be tragic. It could never let her live. So this story, of course, is repeated in the French-authored musical Miss Saigon, which has been played in the US many, many times. And each time Miss Saigon has come to New York, or in my case, to the Twin Cities, the Ordway Theater in the Twin Cities, it has aroused protests, right? In a number of cases, the protests are because some of the Asian roles have been yellowface. The New York production in 1991 was protested because they wanted to cast Jonathan Pryce in a role of a Eurasian character. But other protests have to do with the figure of the Asian woman as always being sort of subservient and always being doomed. I found a really interesting, I was sitting on an airplane some years ago, and I was sitting there flipping through the airline magazine, and I came across an ad, and I went and found this dating site that I thought was really interesting, because in some ways this dating site was evidence to me that this storyline of Madame Butterfly wasn't just confined to the operatic stage. So in some ways, what is interesting about theatrical and cinematic stereotypes is how they infiltrate a kind of broader consciousness. So, what do we know about, the late 19th and the early 20th century as far as Asian Americans go? We know that starting in 1882, there was a series of laws that went all the way up until the Second World War, barring Asian immigration and naturalization. And those laws particularly targeted, earlier laws particularly targeted Asian women, Chinese women. And I think that in some ways, this absence that these laws created of actual Americans of Asian descent was then coupled with the kind of distribution and the popularity of these stereotypical images. So when I talk to students about stereotypes, particularly Asian stereotypes or oriental stereotypes as we call them, I say that, there were two things going on here. One was that there were no real people allowed into the country, or if they were allowed in, their movement and their absorption into American life was severely circumscribed. So you had that absence of real people on the one hand, and you had this overpopulation of images, right? You had images everywhere that were presented on stage, on screen, and those kind of drove away any kind of real knowledge of real people and real relationships. So that what happens with a stereotype is it becomes sort of internalized and almost becomes like a normal way of acting. So that even seemingly positive stereotypes, I think, still limit and fail to capture the complexity of who a person is. So one of the things, again, we can look at this dating ad and say, well, it seems to be a very positive ad, right, of a Japanese woman who is attractive and she's written about as caring and beautiful. Isn't that positive? Well, I would say it may seem positive and certainly preferable to some other more negative stereotypes, but it also severely limits who Japanese women are. So a couple of other sort of broader things. The stereotypes I've been talking about come from a very specific kind of historical moment. And a lot of my work sort of is about trying to locate the precise origins. When did these images start? Who was using them? Who was performing them? How did they get spread around? But there are certain general ideas that I think are harder to pin down. So I just want to flag one of them in the guise of the famous story of Aladdin. So I don't know, has everyone here seen Aladdin? Okay, so if anyone hasn't and needs a introduction, just flag me and I'll do that. So Aladdin is seemingly everywhere still, right? But it is a story that's very, very old, based as one of the many tales of the Arabian Nights, which were very, very popular through Europe from the 16th century on. These were stories which were translated and then theatricalized and became some of the first dramatic presentations of the Orient in the US. So one of the things I'm fascinated by is how this sort of Aladdin kind of haunts us still. And so in the project I'm working on right now, I have a whole chapter on the history of Aladdin. But I'll just say, Aladdin is interesting to me because everyone nowadays sort of thinks about it as presenting the Middle East, right? But I would say that in its original incarnations and its original forms, it was set in China. So what we have is this kind of amalgamated and amorphous vision of what we might say is the East, right? Or to use Edward Said's term, the Orient, right? We've got this geographical designation, which isn't precise at all. So one of the things that has fascinated me about stereotypes as a scholar is no matter how hard I try to pin them down historically and say, okay, here's where it started, here's who was doing them, it seems to have a lot of slippage, right? That there are lots and lots of versions, and they move around in terms of who they're targeting and who's in them. So I could say more about, the sort of interracial dynamics of Aladdin, but I think I'm just going to move on and then talk about a couple more stereotypes, and then we'll pause for a little break and a little Q&A. So one of the things about Aladdin is it does present a very, very familiar set of types, and I want us to kind of view this picture from a very old, now classic Star Wars movie, The Return of the Jedi, and see if we can identify a familiar type that we might call the oriental despot in the figure of Jabba the Hutt. So the oriental despot was the figure of an oriental ruler, whether a sultan or an emperor, who was seen as being cruel and repressive and a villain, right? Evil in some ways. So you have a repetition of this particular figure throughout, I would say, centuries of Western theater, right? European and American theater. This figure comes up again and again and again, where you have a king who is sort of known for his maniacal and uncivilized or barbaric or despotic ways. You often have juxtaposed with that figure a female figure who's in need of rescue, right? An orientalized slave girl. And so one of the things that these stories of the Orient make room for is the place in which to imagine a white savior, right? So I would say, the writers and the dramatists and the composers and the filmmakers of the West, sort of broadly conceived, have long been, for centuries, been fascinated with the East as what we might call an Oriental playground, right? You can stage a fantasy of Western adventure in an Eastern country, especially if it's a sort of unnamed Eastern country, but it could be anywhere. It could be in Asia, it could be in the Middle East, it could be in North Africa. And you have similar characters reappearing. You've got the Oriental despot. You've got the beautiful exotic slave girl who is often in need of rescue by a white savior. And so, I want to just flag a very famous comment that a literary critic, Gayatri Spivak, made years ago about the white savior narrative, in which she said, it in some ways is an excuse for empire, right? Whereby white men can be seen as saving brown women from brown men. And so there are a lot of really interesting things, I think, that these narratives, these stories about the Orient say about gender as well as about race. I'm going to just stop sharing for just a minute, because I know it can get long, and see if are there any questions or comments? Okay, and I see in the chat people are sadly familiar with the picture of Justin Trudeau, and then there's a comment, a wonderful comment about representation and collective memory, right? And so again, one of the things I'm trying to bring home here is how have we inherited ways of viewing others and ourselves, right? How have these filtered into our consciousness in ways that we're not even aware of? So again, the shootings in Atlanta are a very sad instance by which I really feel like a kind of hypersexualization of Asian women has become part of like the way everybody thinks, right? So that as an excuse for gunning down innocent people at their workplace, is this idea of being tempted by sex, right? How can we make that leap without this assumption? I'm just going to check the time. Okay, so I think I have time for a few more comments on representation, and then I think I'd love to just turn it over to some questions and Q&A. I want to mention, when we do work on stereotypes, one of the things that I think is interesting and troubling is that there are a number of stereotypes and they're coexisting, right? So I've been talking a lot about the type of the hypersexualized exotic Asian woman who in some ways invites the love and desire of white masculinity, sort of broadly conceived. So this goes hand in hand with another stereotype that arose around the same era, which is the late 19th century. And I would say that this stereotype is most often called what we call the yellow peril. And that's a stereotype that imagines Asian men, Asian and Asian American men, as invaders and as perpetual foreigners. So this stereotype, it's not hard to see how it kind of comes up again and again. We have an editorial cartoon here about the Chinese in 1899, right? So it's presenting the Chinese, who by 1899 were already barred by law from coming to the United States and from becoming naturalized citizens. And you can see this Chinese man with his queue, with all kinds of weapons, like he's very much armed. And he's also threatening, he's standing in a threatening way over a white woman, right? So clearly the images of the Chinese man as threatening white domesticity and white vulnerability in the home. We've got, I always thought these images look terribly familiar, right? James Bond, North Korean villain in Die Another Day, I think looks very much like this image from well over 100 years before. There are all kinds of political cartoons that you can see that represent the Chinese in particular in various ways. As invaders, you can see the hordes of immigrant labor that are supposed to come if the Chinese jump the exclusion fence. You can see Uncle Sam kicking out the Chinese labor in favor of American labor. So this xenophobic aspect, I think, has been reproduced again and again. We sometimes talk about it as setting the foundations for for building the wall, the rhetoric that people have used today in American politics. What disturbs me about this imagery, though, is not just its politics, right? But the ways in which the imagery moves from the political realm, right, as an attack on people who were perceived to be not in American interest, to a kind of way in which they infiltrate like our daily life. And I want to draw our attention to a very famous image that's on a box of rat poison, the Rough on Rats campaign. So the reason I find this image so disturbing is not just its clear racism and the ways in which it echoes the slogan of the white labor parties that were lobbying for Chinese exclusion, they must go. And this framing of the Chinese immigrant man as eating rats, as vermin. I mean, those messages are really, really clear. But what is even more disturbing is that they happen not in a political cartoon, but on a box of something you could pick up at the supermarket, right? So it's advertising that's used not to sell people to vote one way or another, but to sell them rat poison. This is how conventionalized and normal this violent imagery has become. I'm going to just skip over some of these slides about immigration law and history. So I'm going to just talk in closing, and then I think I'll just open it up. Talk a little bit about these two more recent stereotypes. So I don't want to pretend. I think the butterfly and the yellow peril, those images are still very much with us. But I do want to acknowledge that after the Second World War, there was another image that became a lot more in the public eye, and that was the image of Asian Americans as the model minority. So, like the butterfly, one of the things that we might say is that this image seems to be somewhat positive, right? It's certainly better than viewing Asian people as holding guns and knives and torches ready to kill white women. But on the other hand, this image of the model minority, which is the Asian American as the whiz kid, right? Good at math and science, hardworking, full of family values, bound to succeed despite oppression, that hides its own dark side, as you will. First of all, it's limiting, and secondly, it's not true, right? The model minority, in fact, is not the case for Asian Americans overall. And there's lots of reasons why that is so, but among them is the fact of Asian American, the category of Asian American encompasses so many different people of different ethnic and national origins. Not all of them are model minorities. I think the other problem of the model minority is that it disguises a thing that was going on at the time it came up, which is who are the non-model minorities. The model minority myth arose at a time when there was increased backlash against Black activism, Latinx activism, American Indian activism, and posited that Asian Americans were in fact the good minorities, and there were bad minorities who were seeking social services, who were seeking to draw attention to racism. So what the model minority did, unfortunately, is it produced a myth that Asian Americans don't need the protection or the services of the government or the support of American people. They, in fact, will succeed no matter what. In fact, they'll not only succeed, but they'll outrun white Americans. And so another part of the model minority myth, aside from the fact that it drives a wedge between Asian Americans and other people of color, the downside of the model minority myth is it becomes another form of the yellow peril. So the link between Asian Americans being good at science and technology, and maybe in the Q&A we can talk about being at Virginia Tech. I'm an MIT undergrad, so I know what it's like to be at a technical school. But there's a strong link between sort of envisioning Asian Americans and global technologies and global capitalism. And that's often pictured in a very negative way. I'm just going to end with this slide, this kind of cartoon, which I thought was really interesting and funny or not funny, and have us think a little bit about, how these stereotypes kind of resurfaced during the COVID era. I'm going to just stop my share now and go back to my screen. I'll invite Nina if you want to kind of come back on with me and help me vet questions.
Definitely. Let's see, are there any questions? I guess there was one comment about Star Wars films.
Yeah.
And clothing, and not giving credit to where the clothing comes from.
I don't know that. So is it not Ninaira? Can you say something about that, or put it in the chat? I can't remember. Culturally appropriated some of the clothings. Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough. I'm not enough of a Star Wars person, and I certainly can't compete with the people I know who are. So I am sure, though, that the ideas for costume and design were not original, and in fact were intentionally unoriginal, right? I do know that, like the Raiders of the Lost Ark movies, they wanted a look that resembled older things, right? So some of it is that I think the image that we saw from Jabba the Hutt, that scene, I think you could turn to, drawings of theater work, that shows similarly, the Sultan on his throne. In fact, I have images like this, right? Of the Middle Eastern Sultan sitting there surrounded by his harem, right? And that image just has been repeated again and again and again. And so I think they actually went for that look while they were going for the Star Wars movies. That's my guess. Oh, okay, yeah. I'm not a Star Wars fan, but I was watching a video on it. So was that your impression too, that they were not original? Yeah, and that, I think that whole genre of the adventure film, right? And again, I'm thinking not just of Star Wars, but like the Raiders of the Lost Ark movies, some of the other superhero movies, they go for sometimes for a retro look, right? Where it's a fantasy, it's a sci-fi fantasy, but there's resemblances to older films that were set presumably set in a different country, right? So figures like Jar Jar Binks, right? I mean, people have said, well, that figure seems like a blackface figure, right? Even though it's an alien figure, it still speaks in that way and shuffles around and like is subservient in that way. That's a great comment.
I actually have a question. Because I think there are differences between theater and movies or filmmaking. Although they're now more like sort of like if you think about fences, right? Or how theater has gone into the movie business or vice versa. What do you think right now of sort of Asian American representation on theater and like in terms of more sort of how do you draw parallels, I think,
Yeah.
between the two?
Yeah. No, so I think that they definitely inform each other, right? So we are lucky to have in the Twin Cities an Asian American theater company, Theater Mu, which I've been involved with on and off. And during the pandemic, I ran a little reading series of plays, and one of the plays we read was by a woman named Jean Yoon, who is it was a play about Yoko Ono, and it's a great play. But Jean Yoon is actually an actress on Kim's Convenience, which is a television series, right, set in Canada. And she came to the talk. It was really great because she's like she got her start in theater, right? So there's a lot of people that kind of go back and forth, I think. And those people, those creatives, find life and make connections. So I don't think it's true. I mean, I think people used to think, oh, well, film and television will supplant theater, right? I don't actually think that's the case. I mean, I think that they're different forms of arts, right? Just like people will pay a lot, like Taylor Swift makes more money out of her concerts than she does out of her recordings, like, because people want the live experience. And I think the thing about theater that is, for me, and Asian American theater, or theater maybe by Black, Indigenous, people of color more generally, there has been so few opportunities for actors of color to really show themselves expressively, right? So I love watching them live because I do feel like performance is so magical, like watching somebody who is not shunted off into a stereotypical role, as sometimes still happens in television and film and theater, right? But I would love to see you know, sort of people take that creative freedom that sometimes happens with theater and the live audience. So people have said, for instance, that even when there's a stereotypical role like Kim in Miss Saigon, or I know I just heard a talk on Ruthie Ann Miles playing a role in The King and I, right, on Broadway, and the idea is that you're watching the actor, right? You're okay, it's a stereotypical character, but you're like, oh my goodness, listen to Leah Salonga sing, she's amazing, and you're like, oh my god, even if it's a stereotypical role, I would go see that performance. So there's a little bit of wiggle room with the live performance to appreciate the artistry of the performer, even if what they're doing, you know, may be problematic in other ways.
Thank you. I think is it Naira also said something about they copied some clothing to make
Yeah.
like it look like Mongolia.
Yeah, I love that comment, you know, because one of the things I'm always saying, because I do work with some theater artists, and I was on like, I got together with some people who are dancers who are actually protesting some of the yellowface in like productions like the Nutcracker. You know, they have those Asian dances, and some of them are just off the wall, like incredibly offensive. And so there's a wonderful website called Final Bow for Yellowface, which I, you know, was kind of talking to the people who started that movement. And, you know, one of the arguments we were saying is that people in performing arts and art, they're so creative. So why do they need to go back to these stereotypes? Like, why do they need to use them? And I have that feeling with George Lucas and the Star Wars people too. It's like, oh my goodness, it's science fiction. For God's sake, you don't have to do that. Why do you do that? So, for instance, I mean, the example I always use, and maybe this is a little off the wall, is it's like they used James Earl Jones to play Darth Vader. It's like, why couldn't you just use James Earl Jones to like be Darth Vader? Okay, he's black, but it's science fiction. It doesn't have to follow these rules. You know, I know I'm going to get in trouble with all the Star Wars fans for critiquing that, but I think I've got some backup here.
You do. You really do. Let's see. Dr. Carola Haas said your presentation.
Oh, hi,
Oh, Carola. I was wondering, do you mind? I don't mind putting upgrading everybody to panelists so that you can see everybody if
Oh
you
yeah,
like
that'd
that.
be great if people don't mind. I think it's their call too. If
Yeah,
people
let
want to
me
keep
know
their
if you
screens off.
want to make you panelists, all of you, and then you can keep your screens off if you'd like.
Yeah. So I will talk about Carola's comment while you're doing that. These presentation about insidious stereotypes. Any short readings or films that could help reach white Americans who are still resistant to believing in unconscious bias and make more explicit how these stereotypes have real costs. So I have two sets of recommendations. So one is that last spring they released the PBS series, Asian Americans, and there's a lot of it's mostly history, but there's some perspectives on culture and on representation, which I think are quite powerful. And I would definitely recommend that. I know I've watched it with a number of friends who are not Asian American. My husband is not Asian American. My children are biracial. Everyone was moved. I had a student tell me, I made my students watch it, and a student was saying, you know, I was watching it, and then my girlfriend joined me, and then my parents came down, and then we're all passing around the box of tissues. So I think that film has a lot of broad appeal. So with regard to cultural representation, there are two documentaries which I will put in the chat. They were made a while ago, but I think they're still pretty good, and I think they're up on YouTube. One is by the late Jeff Adechi, and it's called The Slanted Screen, and it's about male representations, Asian American representations of Asian American men. The other is called Slaying the Dragon Reloaded. And that's a remake of a film that was made by Asian Media Access now several decades ago, and it's about Asian American women and film. And it does a really good job, particularly talking about militarization and the role of the sort of idea of the U.S. military, particularly in Southeast Asia, and all the war films and the image of the Asian prostitute. I think it does a really good job of capturing that. But again, it was made a few years ago. There are a number of YouTube artists, and my kids are always telling me, oh, there's this YouTube artist who have done, very clever things. I think there's a young woman, Anna Kana, and I'll just put dating. She talks about dating Asian men or Asian, like, why do white men like Asian women? And it's very funny and it's very short, right? So it's amusing. I think these YouTube artists are just amazing with what they're doing out there and getting the word out in an accessible way. That's a great question. Are there other questions?
There are other questions? I had another one that came up because some of the theater students, or theater students who are doing directing, were talking about how difficult, it is at a tech school, right, to find actors, especially APITA actors. To play in, I think the play was Wonderland.
Oh yeah, Che Yu's play, yeah.
Yeah, and so I think they were trying to figure out how to address that issue appropriately.
Yeah, yeah.
So I thought it'd be good for you to talk about.
Well, and so I think if anyone actually has a question about, like, if I can be of service in recommending plays, because I've done that. Actually, I see that as just part of a larger thing. I've done that for professional theater companies. I've done that for student groups, because I think that theater, one of the things about theater is it serves different purposes. And so rather than just looking for actors with training, I think there's some wonderful theater work out there that is designed for the people who don't consider themselves professional actors or have any interest in doing that. I think there are some wonderful plays that are great for informal readings. I often encourage students to write their own work, right? Because there's so much interest in preserving people's own experiences and histories. And this is why theater exists. I mean, it's not just to put on a play by a famous person and appreciate that. I mean, that's great, but it's to encourage people to tell stories and to perform them and to feel comfortable in their own self and skin. And that, I think, is an incredible theater experience. So I think there are people, who work in the theater world who almost specialize in, like, solo monologues and people doing their own work. And I can recommend, like, mentors for that too. I'm not a theater director, and I'm certainly not an actor. I took a lot of acting, and I was not good, and it was not fun. I was terrified. So I sort of sympathize with the non-actors out there.
Yeah, I guess so. A student asked because he was looking for APITA actors to play in this Wonderland, but it's like pulling teeth, I guess, around here to do it, because most of our students are not in theater here. So it's like, how do you do this ethically, I guess, is what
Well, and the other thing that's difficult, right, with a play like Wonderland is it's a tough play. Right, it's a play that I think demands a certain level of acting skill, and a certain level of vulnerability. Right, the issues in it are not particularly easy. So I think there are schools kind of around the country where they've started like student acting groups, or working groups. I know that even Theater Moo, which is our now thoroughly professionalized theater company, I'm told this story that the artistic director used to walk into like places and ask Asian people, "Have you any interest in acting?" They like he'd have to recruit people because we didn't have a pool, and now we have like lots of people and professionals, equity people. But I think you have to start with what is it meant to do, right? And the thing about making theater for Asian Americans, I think, is still on the level of it's not meaningful if it's just about a certain kind of production value, right? It's got to be meaningful as a message, as a set of activities that people do together. So even if, some of the best performances I've ever seen have been my students in my classes reading a scene, right? Honestly, some of the most moving moments, because you see what it takes to get them there and how vulnerable they can be in front of their classmates, in front of me. And I do feel like that kind of space, if you make it, it'll be worthwhile. So I don't want to say, don't do Wonderland. Chaeyu will be like really pissed off at me. But I will say that there are plays I could recommend, if they're interested, that maybe take, different kinds of acting abilities. I think Diana Sun's play, I'll put it in the chat. She wrote a play called RAW, 'Cause I'm a Woman. And the Nina will know this because it was on the Hemispheric website. There's a video, and it's a play that's really good for students. But it's all women, so yeah.
I teach it.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, it's interesting in that way. I'm dominating the conversation, and I know it's 6 o'clock, so I want to make sure that being cognizant of people's times, but also maybe those who want to ask one or two more questions. Anyone?
I don't want to be that person to ask the last question, but I wanted to sort of ask what your take was with regards to like, if you will, like in queer theory, particularly the work of Jose Munoz talks about dissing identities.
Yeah.
How do you find these stereotypical roles, right? And I thought it was very interesting the way in which you framed representation and then how to sort of subvert them, what is being done on the ground. What is there an element of dissing identity with regards to, modern films with regards to, it's not an Orientalism, and the notion Oriental literally objectifies it. It refers to objects, So is there ways to subvert this? One of the things that I think about, Minari, you referenced, that's through authenticity. Obviously we've seen Parasite, that's an international film.
Yeah.
What are some of the ways in which arts can save vis-a-vis, through these acts of dissing identities, if you will, by retooling them, if you will, through the arts and the artistic process itself?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So I would say, there are different basic strategies, right? And I think some of these have been brought up time and again. This whole discussion that sometimes took place around Asian American literature, and in terms of what is the real and what is the fake, right? That the fake is the stereotype. It's catering to a white gaze. It's oppressive, and then we have to find the authentic, the real. I would say, that both the real and the fake are constructions, right? They're different kinds of performance. So for instance, to go to Jose Munoz's work, whose work I so totally respect. I mean, I think the idea of queer identity, certain queer identities, as reappropriating stereotypes, right? Taking them and performing them to gain visibility and control, right? It's different from saying I have no other options, right? It's a use of this as an established part of the vocabulary, and to say I can do this and I can move away from it at will, right? I don't have to stay in there. So I think you see artists trying to do that, sort of moving in and out of the type, like not just pretending it's not there and there's like a real person underneath there. And that's kind of an interesting way of thinking about it, right? There is exactly too the idea that, uncovering spaces that are not necessarily seen as American spaces or Asian spaces, right? Undoing the idea that there used to be this model of Asian American identity that said that we were all caught between worlds, right? As if we were never fully ourselves. We were always imitating somebody else, right? And I think that, again, that's like a trap, right? That's a sort of saying, well, they're really, that's sort of limiting identity to one thing or the other. And so I think people have done work with that too. I think the lovely thing for me in working in theater is that theater is about the performance, right? It privileges the performer, and the performance is never total, and it's always flawed. And you always take a curtain call, and there's always sweat running down your face at the end because you're like, okay, I'm out of character now, right? So it exposes those fault lines in the imagined constructions, in those fantasies, or it tries to, right? And I think that's one reason I really like theater. Now I'm romanticizing theater, but I get to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
Anybody else?
I have a quick question. Thanks, Professor Lee, for your wonderful presentation. I was wondering what you thought about the current push for representation. You see all this glowing discourse around, well, some of the films you mentioned, but also, let's say, Hamilton or Crazy Rich Asians, etc. And so there's that on one hand, and it seems like this positive, recuperative, mainstream kind of identitarian position. But then that erases some of these other kind of violences and voids, structural violences. So what do you think, or how do you think we should deal with, let's say, cross-ethnic coalition building? That it seems either or, Black Lives Matter, or, Stop Asian Hate. But of course, you see these violences as really enmeshed, and that's something that's not really talked about in mainstream kind of culture production.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's been on my mind a lot, right? As I listen to a lot of conversations, and people, I think, are worried about these, what are perceived to be, again, conflicting interests, right? And they're always, it seems to be always sort of Black versus Asian, right? That's being put there as okay, we either can pay attention to Black suffering, or we can pay attention to Asian suffering, but we can't pay attention to both. And I was thinking, first of all, that's ridiculous, right? I mean, and second of all, the racism is related, right? There's a larger kind of structural set of relationships. And yes, they are complicated, and maybe people have a hard time getting their head around them, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, right? So I do feel like maybe the hopeful thing is to continue to talk through this moment in which I find it really hard to see any resolution happening, right? And I do feel like there's this exhaustion that we're all feeling, and it's not just about the pandemic, it's also about the politics and the endless, and you keep hoping it'll just go away, right? And I do feel like preserving energy, right? Because I think it's going to take a while, right? To continue this, to continue to learn through this. But the positive thing about it is that, there is conversation, right? There are people talking together, right, and trying to not leap to solidarity, but to make a step that way, right? Or reinvestigate what solidarity means or what allyship means, but to continue to have that conversation. And so that means if nothing is resolved, actually that's good. Because I think better a lack of resolution than a false resolution, which is kind of what we've had before. People feel as though around here, with the murder of George Floyd, which is very much on our minds right now, what is the verdict going to be? I think that everybody's asking that question. And I keep thinking, this is because it's a trial not just of a police officer, but it's a trial about American justice. In some ways, the verdict isn't going to resolve what the real problems are, right? I mean, so like the pandemic, I think we're going to be dealing with grief for a long time, and we need to find some ways to deal with it other than just being angry. I feel so much anger all the time, and I keep thinking it's like grief, right? I mean, you lose something and you're angry and you're irritable and the only time I'm not angry is when I'm talking to Nina, because I love Nina, but I do feel like talking to people, is healing, right? I mean, and it's good. I'm really glad. I don't really have an answer. What do you think?
I think it's complicated, and I do agree. I think of Judith Butler and mourning as a site of solidarity. I'm poorly paraphrasing, but it opens up vulnerability, but then also thinking across coalitions. I mean, something a long conversation. So thank you for that.
Well, and I think in some ways, feeling trauma, even if we feel that it's unequally distributed, I think the feeling of trauma is something that is broadly relatable, right? That and then how do we deal with it? I mean, I think it's more complicated because some of the trauma comes from human causes, human on human causes, and some of it's coming from sort of larger suffering that's going on right now.
Viet, are you working on project right now in terms of that? Just curious.
Yeah, yes, I am, but I'm cognizant of your time. Don't want to take up too much. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about kind of how we can all really think through cross-ethnic coalition building. And artists are wonderful. Christina Wong is doing anti-sewing club and thinking about other solo performance artists that do that. So I think artists and scholars such as yourself, Professor Lee and Nina, and of course Walker, who's an artist on the call, I think we're really envisioning ways to heal beyond these standard narratives.
Yeah. Well, and hopefully, I mean, making art, again, this is a long-term process, right? And so one of the things, because politics and the media being what they are, everything is right about the here and now. So one of the things I would love to see is ways of sustaining art making throughout the course of our lives, right? Because that art changes in perspective and wisdom as we go. So how do we, not just make reactive art, right, and have all the artists sort of turn to the same subject, but say, okay, these conditions have made us aware of how much we need art. And so because we need it and we need it to be there for us, right, how do we nurture this throughout, right? So that's been on my mind a lot because of the pandemic, because of the lack of resources for performing artists in particular. It's just been a really hard time for people that way.
Wow, thank you so much. I'm gonna have to like have you, Joe and Viet and everybody else on a panel.
Oh, I would love to have continue
Across.
this conversation.
Yeah,
It's so
totally.
nice to see people. Carola, how long has it been?
I'm gonna stop the recording now, but I still
Okay.
want to hang on to.